The Dano-Swedish War of 1808–1809 was a war between Denmark, Norway and Sweden due to Denmark-Norway's alliance with France and Sweden's alliance with the United Kingdom during the Napoleonic Wars. Neither Sweden nor Denmark-Norway had wanted war to begin with, but once pushed into it through the respective alliances. Sweden made a bid to acquire Norway by way of invasion, while Denmark-Norway made ill-fated attempts to reconquer territories lost to Sweden in the 17th century. Peace was concluded on grounds of status quo ante bellum on 10 December 1809. Background: during the War of the First Coalition, Denmark, Norway and Sweden had remained neutral. The two Nordic countries also intended to follow this policy during the War of the Second Coalition and had in 1800, together with Prussia and Russia, formed the Second League of Armed Neutrality in order to protect the neutral shipping against the British policy of unlimited search of neutral shipping for French contraband. The League would, however, be dissolved following the British naval attack against Copenhagen and the death of Tsar Paul I of Russia in 1801. After the collapse of the alliance, and Denmark-Norway's brief war against the United Kingdom, Sweden and Denmark still continued the neutrality policy. In 1805 Sweden joined the war against France, but following the rapid French advance through northwest Germany and a defeat at Lübeck, Swedish forces had to withdraw to Swedish Pomerania. Attempts at peace negotiations between France and Sweden was initiated, and Emperor Napoleon I of France offered Sweden in the autumn of 1806 Norway in exchange for Swedish Pomerania, but the negotiations failed, and in early 1807 French forces invaded and eventually occupied Swedish Pomerania. Following the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, the main focus of France and Britain was directed towards Denmark. Napoleon wanted to include the neutral Denmark-Norway in the continental system, while the United Kingdom feared that the Danish fleet should fall into the hands of the French. Britain's attack and subsequent bombardment of Copenhagen led to the seizure and destruction of large parts of the Danish fleet and the Danish choice to conclude an alliance with Napoleon. The alliance between Denmark, Norway and France was signed at Fontainebleau on 31 October 1807. The agreement indicated vague promises from the French that they would help Denmark-Norway regaining its fleet, while Denmark had to commit themselves to participate in an eventual war against Sweden together with France and Russia. Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark-Norway was reluctant to participate in war against Sweden, but he decided to declare war against Sweden with the aim of conquering the territory which Denmark had lost after the Treaty of Brömsebro and Treaty of Roskilde. And since Sweden's attention was on Finland following the Russian invasion in February 1808, he saw it as easier to take back the territories. On 14 March 1808, the Danish minister in Stockholm presented the declaration of war to the Swedish government, and the Swedish king, Gustav IV Adolf, replied with planning an invasion of Sjælland in order to force Denmark to conclude separate peace. This plan was, however, temporarily sidelined, and the Swedish troops in Götaland were instead placed in a defensive position, following rumors that Napoleon had sent reinforcements to Denmark. King Gustav IV instead approved the plan drawn up by Gustav Moritz Armfeldt on an invasion of Norway to compensate for a possible loss of Finland. Armies. The Swedish Army. The Swedish Army stationed in Sweden counted a total of 23,000 men, 7,000 in southern Sweden under the command of Count Johan Christopher Toll, 14,000 towards the Norwegian border under the leadership of Gustav Moritz Armfeldt, and 2,000 in Norrland under Johan Bergenström. The Swedish Army was fairly well equipped and the soldiers were well trained, but under the pressure from on two fronts. The Swedes had been forced to retain the ability to send troops wherever they were needed the most. The main theatre of war was in the east, where the Russian invasion threatened the Swedish rule in Finland, but the threat from Denmark, Norway and France was taken seriously. The Swedish Western Army was divided into two wings. The right wing was led by Armfeldt himself, and the left wing were led by Major General Vegesack. The army's right wing furthermore consisted of Colonel Carl Pontus-Gan's flying corps of approximately 650 men in Dalby, Colonel Leonstadt's 1st Brigade of approximately 1,600 men in Ida, Colonel Schroeter's 2nd Brigade of about 2,500 men in Toxmark, Colonel Bror-Cederström's 3rd Brigade of approximately 1,750 men in Holmedel, and Colonel Johan Adam Kronstedt's 4th Brigade of approximately 1,700 men in the area east of the Marker. The army's left wing consisted mainly of one brigade at Stromstad, one at Toftedal, and one in the area between Gothenburg and Uddevalla. Swedish regiments: Hälsing Regiment, Skaraborg Regiment, Kalmar Regiment, Life Grenadier Regiment, Bohuslän Regiment. The Danish-Norwegian Army. The Danish-Norwegian Army combined consisted of 36,000 men. The Danish Army could muster 14,650 men, but only 5,000 of them could be used for attacks against the Swedish. The Norwegian Army had been prepared for a future war with Sweden since the fall of 1807, but since they were forced to organize coastal protection along the long Norwegian coast against attacks from the British warships who tried to close the connecting lines between Norway and Denmark, the army was in a poor state in late February 1808. The army ended up with a lack of weapons, lead, clothes, food, and many soldiers had equipment that was close to 20 years old. The Norwegian army was under the leadership of Prince Christian August of Augustenburg, who at the time was president of the Norwegian Government Commission, which had been established when the British initiated the blockade between Norway and Denmark in 1807. Christian August would later during the war also be appointed Governor-General of Norway. The Norwegian Army 24 dragoon companies totaling about 1,800 riders, 14 musketeer battalions for a total of about 8,400 men, 10 sharpshooter companies totaling about 1,200 men, 10 depot battalions for a total of about 5,000 men, 8 grenadier battalions for a total of about 4,800 men, 6 fortress batteries totaling about 300 men, 3 field batteries totaling approximately 300 men, 2 ski battalions totaling about 600 men, 1 Jaeger battalion of added 600, later 720 men, a light battalion of about 600 men, a pioneer company of about 150 men. Stadtholder Christian August had only 8,000 men available at the beginning of the war along the border from Svinesund to Trondelag, and they had to take in many untrained recruits in order to fill up the ranks. The Norwegian defense, after the stationing of the troops at the border was completed in late March 1808, Christian August divided the southern forces along the border on Ostlande from south to north. Colonel Hans Gram Holster's right-wing brigade with approximately 3,400 men in the area from Svinesund to Rodines. Colonel Werner de Sousa's center brigade with about 1,900 men in the area from Rodines to Kongsvinger. Colonel Bernhard Dietolf von Staffeldt's left-wing brigade with roughly 1,300 men in the area from Kongsvinger to Elverum. Colonel Christopher Frederick Lozo's 1st Reserve Brigade with some 1,700 men in the area from Vormsund to Fetsund. Colonel Johan Andreas Ohm's 2nd Reserve Brigade with approximately 650 men from Gronsund to Fetsund. The Norwegian troops in the southern defense amounted to about 9,000 men. In addition, there were 3,300 men stationed in Trondelag for the defense in the north, Colonel Carsten Gerhard Bang with a brigade of about 2,100 men in Røros, Lieutenant General Carl von Schmettau with a brigade of about 1,200 men in Innherred. It was also stationed 2,000 men in Trondheim and Kristiansand, and 6,200 men in Fredrikshavn and Bergen fortress garrisons Fredrikstad, about 2,350 men, Fredriksen, about 1,250 men, Kongsvinger fortress, about 900 men, Akershus fortress, about 800 men. The French army. At the outbreak of war, Napoleon had sent reinforcements to Denmark from France, Spain and the Netherlands under the leadership of Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, which meant that the Danish-French force consisted of approximately 81,000 men. The French made it a condition for their participation in the war against Sweden that the coalition army was to be under French command. War preparations. On the 5th of March, several days before the Danish government had decided to declare war on Sweden, Marshal Bernadotte, who at the time was French governor of Hamburg and the other Hanseatic cities, started his march towards Denmark with the coalition army of 32,000 men. But it seems likely that Napoleon at the time was not willing to let the troops go into direct action, because after Bernadotte had camped with large parts of the coalition army on Østjylland, he was not ordered to continue his advance against the Danish shipping ports. The ice also started breaking up in mid-March, and to everyone's surprise, the first British warships started to show up even as ice floes still lay densely packed. Admiral Hyde Parker had wintered in Gothenburg the winter of 1807–08 with his squadron and came down very early in the straits between the Kattegat and Baltic Sea. Bernadotte, who had lost valuable time while lying icebound, also lost the ability to secure passage before the arrival of the British warships. The troops' presence in Østjylland, Fyn and Jutland was more a burden than help to the Danish population. Another problem arose after the news that Spain had revolted against Napoleon was known in Denmark, and the Spanish troops had to be disarmed and interned. In mid-April 1808, the Danish-French plan for an invasion of Sweden was called off and attention was directed towards the Swedish-Norwegian border.